David, our friend Niraj, had posted in the forums a good question about caching.
Ah,
Here is the question, the original question. It says, I have noticed that the cache gets erased each time the BT configuration file is updated. That means the user has to wait for each screen of photos and PDFs and docs to be downloaded again. Even though none of these files had changed, only the BT config file had changed. Several questions. One, is there a way to not clear out the cache when the config file is updated? Two, is there a way to selectively update only the changed files? Three, can the updated files be automatically downloaded into the app? And four, with the arrival of iOS 7, I hear content can be updated as a background process. How will that capability fit into the BuzzTouch framework? And that's from Niraj.
there's a bunch of questions here. I'm typing them on my
Yeah.
screen to make sure I understand what they were. Update
Okay.
some data. I know exactly what he's talking about.
Okay.
There was selectively updating some content. There was updating some data. There was iOS 7 implications.
And there was, is there a way to
Background
not clear the cache?
and not clear the cache. Exactly. We want to talk about these all individually.
Okay.
Not clearing the cache when only the config.txt file has changed.
Right.
Okay, awesome
So,
questions.
well, let me throw the newbie question in first,
Yeah.
in case we've got a new user. Just the 30-second rundown of what is the BT config file?
Perfect. Perfect. So what is the config file? I'll put that as question 0. What is the config.txt file? And that's a good question. So I thought you were going to ask, and I'm going to go ahead and ask it too. What is this? What is caching? What is cache? So we'll talk about the config file, and we'll talk about the overall concept of caching, and then we'll go through these questions kind of with as much detail as we can. So we'll start with what is caching, because that's not a BuzzTouch concept. That's just it's actually kind of a slang concept, I think, that we've all developed, computer guys like us use to describe, keeping things around, keeping them in memory, keeping them on a hard drive, keeping them in a file system, just saving things. And so think of the word cache. Isn't there like a hobbyist site like called geocaching or something where they use their GPS and they find
Yes.
treasures in the, things like that. So the word cache has been around for a long time, and it's generally spelled C-A-C-H-E, and it refers to something kept around for later use. That's kind of my generic definition of what a cache is. So let's move on and say, what is this config.txt file? So applications in mobile phones and mobile tablets and regular computers and big computers, little computers, applications use data all the time. And a lot of this data is compiled in the app itself. A lot of this data comes from external resource like the internet. A lot of this data comes from a database, right? There's lots of different ways to feed data to an app. And so in our world, in the BuzzTouch world, we have one kind of main configuration file that every app uses called the configuration.txt file, or config.txt. So when you're looking at one of these config files in your project, you'll see all kinds of, technically it's called data or JSON data, but you'll see all kinds of information that in essence describes how the app behaves. So the config file's whole purpose is to describe how each screen is laid out and how each button works and how the thing performs. And so that is fundamentally what the config.txt file does. And so the reason that the caching question comes up is because the configuration text file does not have to come from a static, not going to change text file like you would find in a typical project. You can feed a configuration file to your application by way of a data URL or by way of a remote hosted file. So the example of that would be is your application launches and it gets its configuration information, its instructions from, say, a Dropbox or from your website or from buzztouch.com. And so remotely saving that information allows you to manipulate it and change it after the software has been installed on an end user's device. And so that's
Quick
called caching. Yep.
quick question here.
Yep.
Is that concept that you use, is that unique to a BuzzTouch app, or do all developers do that?
Yeah, great question. It's not necessarily unique per se. Downloading remote data is very common. The extent in which you do it and how much you consider it, foundational to the way that your app works, I think is kind of across the board. We believe that it's very, very important and a fundamental way to construct an app, and we use it extensively. And a lot of these, app maker sites and things that are kind of popping up and have kind of caught on to this trend because it is powerful. Okay, so it's not unique to BuzzTouch necessarily, but considering a significant part of how an application is engineered is, I guess, unique to BuzzTouch. We drive everything by these config files. And so, but the other thing, let's back up a little bit. I said that is caching. That's a little bit odd. What I meant when I said that was when you download something from a remote URL, a picture, a text file, a movie, and then save it to the device for later use, that's what we refer to when we say caching. So the reason that we want to save a text file, a configuration file that you downloaded from a URL to the device, so that the next time the device launches, it doesn't have to download it every time. And when you're on an airplane, or when you're out in the woods, or you just don't have, you don't want to use bandwidth, or you don't want to wait, it's already on the phone, it's just much better. So that's what we're talking about when we're saying caching, is this idea that if we saved it after we downloaded it, we only need to download it one time. So that's great.
Right.
However, it introduces new problems when you think of these ideas. And the example like Niraj is bringing up is, okay, you cache it on the device, it's not going to download it again, but now it's changed. And so you change it on your remote server, and it could be anything. It could be the PDF, it could be the picture, it could be this whole configuration file, anything. You change it, well, your application doesn't automatically know that you've changed it on your remote location. How could it? So logically, you would jump to this idea of maybe polling for changes, or going somewhere and asking, has this picture changed, or has this text file changed, or something. And so most of us can get our head around that pretty easily. So that's what the application is going to do. It's going to poll a URL, the web, for, in essence, a change notification or a last modified date. And that's what, for the technical people in our audience, that's what the report to cloud method is all about. The report to cloud method, its whole purpose is to jump on the internet behind the scenes. This is the phone. Connect to the internet behind the scenes. Go see if this data, the app for the data, has changed. And if so, maybe do something like download it or alert the user and say, hey, would you like to update, things like this. So we have this built-in process already that BuzzTouch apps use called report to cloud. And it happens pretty often. It reports to cloud every time you launch the app. It reports to cloud, when you come to the home screen, if it's been a while. It does this on a regular basis, and it's searching for a date. And so the URL, the internet site that it goes to, or the BuzzTouch control panel, or the Dropbox, or wherever the report to cloud goes to, will return something, will get something back like this, that looks like this. This is not exact because I don't have the code in front of me for that. I don't have a report to cloud result file in front of me, but it looks like something like this. It'll be a timestamp. It'll be a timestamp. And basically, it might be last modified, something like that. So it just downloads this very, very small, lightweight, tiny little text file, and it saves it to the phone. And now it knows the last time it was modified. So the next time it checks the report to cloud URL, the address, it may get this, in which case nothing has changed, and it doesn't need to do anything. Or maybe it gets this, a new date. And if it gets a new date, it says, hey, something has changed.
Right.
Let's go get it. So this is where the meat of Niraj's questions come in. what changed? You've got an app with 400 screens in it. You have an app with 50 pictures and 12 movies, and it didn't all change,
Right.
right? Something changed, but what changed? And so what Niraj is asking is, hey, I don't want to get everything. This is crazy. I just want to get one thing. And so fundamentally, that makes perfect sense that it would ask that question. Technically speaking, we're going to move on to some strategies around how to deal this or whatever. Technically, right now, in the way that your project comes, it's not made to do that. It's made to re-download stuff. And the reason that it does that is because it doesn't download everything all at once. If you have this app with 50, let's say 50 pictures in it, and you're flipping through a gallery and all the images come from a URL, the web, you're flipping through the gallery, it doesn't load all 50 images as soon as you launch the gallery. It loads one image at a time. And that's called lazy loading. And so we lazy load data as you need it, screen by screen, menu by menu, situation by situation. And each time we get something, we save it on the phone. And then the next time you go back to that something, since it's there and cached, it's really fast. So a really fun example of that is if you look at a gallery, a photo gallery plugin, you make a big long gallery full of images that come from the internet. When you're swiping forward for the first time, you'll see the little loading on each one.
Right.
But when you go back, they're there. And then you close the app and you come back and you go to that gallery the next time. They're pretty quick.
Right.
So that's how it all loads. So it's important to know that before you understand the next kind of logic that we came up with back in the day, which was, well, what happens when you get a new flag that says this app's changed and we don't know what changed? Because we're not checking everything, we're checking one thing. Hey, did the app change? And so when it says it's changed, it gets rid of all of the cached data. All of it, the pictures, the movies, it all goes away. And it starts over. And it lazy loads each thing, each time you see it. Because again, it doesn't know what actually changed. And so, does that make sense, Warren? I mean,
oh yeah,
it's kind of elementary on one way, but also, elegantly simple on the other way.
Yeah, it makes perfect sense. And if it's a small app, that's not a big deal. But like
Bingo.
you were saying, if it's got 400 screens and all these movies, that can be almost painful to try to do anything new with that app.
Exactly. So that's why these are great questions. So it is a trade-off, right? Do we want, what is the best way to do this? So there's been some discussion in the past about maybe ways to improve this, and that makes perfect sense. And maybe we'll get to that, but let's keep going down his questions. So one, selective content updates. We're going to come back to this in just a sec, but fundamentally, can I do this with the way BuzzTouch is built right now? No. You have to figure out your own kind of special way to deal with that unique screen, let's say. So that concretely answers that. I'll show you kind of how that would be easy, but that concretely answers that. That goes right in the line with number 2, update some data. You wouldn't ask number 1 if you didn't have number 2. In other words, if I want to selectively update some content, that's kind of the same question as update some data, but not all data. So same idea. No, when you hit refresh, the way that it works right now is before it even goes and gets all the new data, it gets rid of everything in its cache to kind of lighten it up and speed it up and all of that kind of stuff. And number 4, we'll go back to the iOS one, but not clearing the cache when only the config.txt file has changed. The reason that it can't do that is because, again, on this concept that it doesn't know what changed, if it doesn't get rid of all of these old files, a couple of things can happen. Let's go back to the simple image example. In one situation, you have an image called bluebackground.png, and it goes on your quiz screen. And you load up the quiz screen, and the app, and it comes from the internet. The app downloads bluebackground.png from this internet address. It saves it on the phone. You leave this quiz, you come back to the quiz, blue background's on the device already, it's already there, off you go. Now you go into your control panel and you change it to green background. on this particular screen. This happens all the time. People make dynamic changes all the time. Well, you've changed it to green background. Well, you load up the app, and it checks the last modified date for the app. It says, yep, you got new stuff. You hit go for it. You download the config file. You go back to the quiz, and you've got a green background that had to, again, come from the internet because you didn't have it. But where's our blue background? It's, in essence, it's unused, but it's still on the phone because we downloaded it 5 minutes ago before it was changed.
Right.
So we have to get rid of the cache. We have to clear the cache when things change, because if we don't, you're going to end up taking up the whole device is going to fill up with stuff that is no longer used anymore.
So this ensures the way that this is done, that once you launch an app, you have the most current version.
Exactly. But the trade-off is this idea of lazy loading. Screen by screen, I got to wait a moment to get this thing. And so there was I guess a fifth question in this that I didn't write on my little thing here. 5, we should talk about it. Download, we'll just call these assets like pictures, images, and stuff all at once. This is an interesting question. Isn't it logical to at least consider the idea that when the app first launches, couldn't it browse the configuration rules, the config file, find everything in the config file that is on the internet, pictures, songs, movies, data, download it all at the beginning, or all at once, or maybe in some magical way it's in the background running this long pool or queue, this long process. And this is taking us into the number 3 here, the iOS 7 implications. So wouldn't it make sense that you would just start this and go for it? Yes, you could do that. There are lots of apps that do that. The problem with what we're doing, not the problem, but the reason that I believe fundamentally that that's a bad idea in most cases is pretty simple to understand. It's bandwidth and time. People build apps that are extraordinarily large and have lots and lots of content in them, and to tell the app to download it all in advance, in many cases, I would say probably half the cases, it would take an extraordinary amount of time to do that, and it would suck up a lot of bandwidth, and it would fill up the guy's phone. If I installed Mirage's app and it put 4 gigabytes worth of pictures on it right from the beginning, I might be a little worried about this app. Right? So it just kind of goes against the...
Yeah. I wouldn't be very happy about it because there's
exactly.
just a limited amount of real estate inside this phone.
Exactly. So it kind of goes against the natural flow of things in terms of the internet. However, in Niraj's defense, let's think of a more specialized case where it makes nothing but sense. Let's say that you have an employee whose application that you made for him is a series of service manuals that are all PDFs. And he goes out into the field, and he crawls on his hands and knees into these no internet connected areas under a building or whatever, or out in the woods. He needs those PDFs, and he doesn't have them because they come from the internet, they're fed to your phone, but now he doesn't have a connection. So, and he's not technical, so he doesn't understand that he might have to visit all these screens before he goes on. So it makes sense in this case to where, because it's more of a specialized or a controlled or a predictable situation, that the app user would understand that there's going to be a little bit of a delay at the beginning. You'll show him a graphic, downloading assets or something like that, and then he'd be thrilled because he wouldn't have to do this each time. And that makes a lot of sense. Or think of an app where it's, trail maps and things like this, where you're out in the woods, that you would want this stuff before you went out on the trail. And so totally makes sense.
Now,
technically, go ahead.
I was just going to say, isn't it possible, not using the config file, but basically to include some of these static types of things, kind of like an icon file,
Uh-huh.
in the app itself in the bundled package.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And so in that strategy, which people do all the time, pros and cons, just like everything else, your assets as they're described in the config.txt file would not have URLs associated. Like this one right here has an image file URL. This is an image on Kitsy's carousel plugin, which is a cool menu that spins around. And so the assets for this image are using an image URL. Instead of using a URL, they would just use the name of the image, which in this case is, new JPEG or whatever. And that would be included in the project, just like you said, Warren. And it would get compiled into the project. And as soon as you download and installed the app, you'd have it. Very common, very popular, pros and cons. Pro, it's all there. Works awesome. Con, it's a pretty big, heavy app. Got to download this big, heavy thing. Pro, easy to update. In other words, technically easy to update. You don't have to understand much. Drag the new thing into your project, compile, send it to Apple. Con, hard to update. What do you mean I got to compile it and send it to Apple? Right? There's different perspectives. And so if you use the remote thing and you have your understanding of that and you'll prefer that method, this doesn't really make much sense. But if you don't understand that world of connecting to the internet and feeding assets to your app, well then updating through Apple might be easier. And so there's always little trade-offs, but people do generally have a balance. They generally have a balance of these techniques, and the core fundamental parts of their application are generally included in the bundle when they send it to the App Store. The background art, the welcome intro video or song or whatever that doesn't really change, and then other parts of their application change selectively. Which takes us to our last little topic in my mind for this conversation is, how do you selectively change things? I know BuzzTouch, from what David just said, doesn't really built to make it to work that way, but he also said it'd be kind of easy to do that. So let's look at an example of how we might selectively update something. And one of the best examples is the data URL that you can use when you're building a menu. If you've noticed the list menu, like the plugin I made, the list menu, you go to your control panel and you enter items into the list. They're menu items. If you don't enter any items into the list, and instead you use a data URL to provide those items, in essence, you're on one screen's situation, on one screen's case, you have a whole separate file that feeds that screen instead of the whole app. And now when you look at that menu and you've used the data URL option, you can pull it down to refresh it. You can pull down the menu and it kind of bounces and it reloads the menu items. So this is an example of selectively refreshing the content on one screen without everything else in the whole app being affected. And so the logic and technically how we do that is actually pretty simple. And what we do, let's look at this app that I have open doesn't have any plugins in it. But let's go back to that report to cloud method. It's the same idea. We look for the URL and the screen's data, and then we fire up a URL connection, and we download the information for the screen. And so on the menu screen, it's the same thing. We drag the menu down to make it bounce. It knows that there's a data URL in its configuration, goes to the data URL and gets the new items. So that's one way. So that's a very manual way, though, and this might raise more questions for Niraj, like, wait a minute, you're swiping the screen down, you're basically tapping a refresh button.
Right.
Nothing's automatic about that, which is very true, but it is nonetheless a way. So one way to do it, let's say that you have a PDF screen and you want the PDF to be saved and cached on the device, but you also want to be able to replace just that PDF, ad hoc style whenever the user wants or whatever. So you could use a refresh option, and you could put a button or a swipe or a double tap or whatever to refresh that PDF. So that's one way, but that way would require some user intervention. The only other way to do it, the most straightforward way to do it is if you didn't want any user intervention and they loaded up the PDF and you wanted it to magically tell the user, hey, there's a new PDF for this screen, not the whole app, but just this PDF, is you would implement kind of a little mini report to cloud for that screen, and you would have to figure out a way to tell the app that this PDF has changed. So you might put a text file on a Dropbox that has a last modified date for every screen, right? You might have 12 text files, one for each. This is just one way to do it.
Right.
One for each screen. Query that modified date. If it's changed, tell the user to, or just automatically get the new PDF. That would be one way to do it. Another way to do it, you could store all of the files in your project in a database, and you could query the database and ask it for changes. That's getting a little bit more technical. Taking it a step further, if you're running the self-hosted control panel and you're running BuzzTouch on your own site, you could absolutely query on a screen-by-screen basis. You can say, when were you modified? And if you look at your control panel, it shows you the modified date on every screen. So you could whip together a little PHP script, and then on a screen-by-screen basis, you could learn this. And so fundamentally, it's the idea that you have to have a way to tell the app that something has changed. And the only way to do that is it's flipped around. The app asks, has anything changed, and it gets an answer. So that's called polling. I misspoke there when I said the only way to do it. There is another way. There is another way. There's always 1,000 ways. Think about push notifications. There is a concept called headless push notifications. And what a headless push notification is, just kind of slang, but it's popular, is it's a push notification that the user never gets alerted about. It's a push notification that doesn't pop up on the screen with a "you have new content" button. It's a push that doesn't show up. And the reason that you push this notification to the phone is to tell the phone that there's new content. See, there's a difference between pushing that to the phone and asking the phone to check every 10 minutes. Right? So one strategy is the phone polls on a regular basis, like every time the PDF screen loads.
Right.
In which case it's largely only going to happen when the app's running, right? It's only going to happen when the person's using the app. The other way is to push that news. Hey app, I got a new PDF. You might want to grab it before the guy opens the screen again, right? You can tell. So these are lots of complex ideas, but ultimately it all revolves around the same thing. The app has to learn that something's new, and then it's got to go get it. That's kind of the way it works. And so what do you think? I mean, is it far too complicated for Joe user, or do you think that kind of makes some sense?
Well, those last concepts may get a little more complicated than our user base is used to, especially that headless push notification. You know, it's kind of mind-boggling that how it might work. But I go back to something that you've said many times. I've heard it, and it's almost a perception thing. It's nice for the end user to see that something has changed.
Yeah.
Because then they know that you're taking care of the app, that this is new and fresh content. It's not stale all the time. That really does, in my mind, have a lot of benefit.
Yes.
Your app's content has changed. Would you like to update now? Yes.
Yep.
That means that David has been working on this to make it better.
Yeah, totally. Totally. And I agree 100% with you. And one thing that people often kind of underutilize and overlook or are just downright worried about is this idea of letting Apple help you keep customers happy, or Google. And I'll give you an example. We all remember that, app approved moment when your app's in the store and you're super stoked, and you see it in the app market and you're just like, woo, it's in. A lot of people think that that's kind of the end of the road for their process with this application, and they're worried to death that if they submit an update Apple or Google's less because they're not subjected to any inspection. But if they submit an update to Apple, they may get rejected. And their application update, they're going to have to deal with something big pain in the butt.
Well, it's legitimate. I mean, we've all
It
dealt
is
with
legitimate. It is legitimate. However, chances are it won't get declined unless you did something crazy to it. If they liked it before, they're probably going to like it now. And the power of Apple telling the end user that this application is updated, which happens automatically for you when you post an update to the App Store.
Mm-hmm.
From our experience, what we found is the power, it's far more powerful than if you tell them the app has been updated. And when I mean you, the app owner.
Right.
So keeping that in mind, the most successful app owners and publishers and developers out there are always balancing this idea, and they generally put their apps on a regularly scheduled update process or a calendar thing. And they literally, how many updates have you seen where it says bug fixes, right? I mean, they just put these updates out. Sometimes I even wonder if there's anything different. But they do it on a regular basis, and for the most part, like you said, I'm pretty happy that Twitter's got a new version. I'm pretty happy that, I like this. I might not see concretely what they've done,
yeah,
but I like the idea that this is happening.
Well,
and so it's a great...
I'm more likely to go back and open that app after it's updated to see what's changed.
Totally. And so that's a very powerful concept. And so far, Apple's not charging us any money to do this. They're letting us do this, by submitting our binary, and I think that's a very powerful thing. The other thing that people underestimate the power of is you said you already had the app and you're happy to see these updates. I'm with you, right? We said that we like this notification. We're cool. Think about the person considering installing the app. It's in the App Store and it shows it's never been updated, right? It's one version from 8 months ago.
Right.
I don't want this thing on my phone.
Nope.
As compared to a consistent flow of every 60, 90 days or whatever, 6 weeks, if you want to get aggressive, 3 weeks, whatever. This pattern that I think we all appreciate a little bit, right? I think that we begin to understand this guy's passionate. This gal likes this app. She's into it. And so I'm going to buy it. It's $1, whatever. So, that's a pretty big deal. And none of that's too hard to understand. And so lots of caching concepts. I wish, I struggle with kind of idea overload, and there's lots of different ways to make things better and lots of different ways to engineer these things. But I'm kind of a database guy, in my roots. Like I love data and managing information and all this kind of stuff. And I have I could make a lot of improvements to the BuzzTouch core project in terms of how it manages these caching ideas and this remote information idea, and make quite a bit more granular, give more granular control to developers with screen-by-screen stuff and all that kind of thing. I'm always having to balance. If I do this, then the new person who's never made an app before might have a little harder time understanding. It's a constant balance. And so I do think that our applications core, the iOS core and the Android core that you're getting from your control panels, it's certainly evolving over time into a more and more sophisticated package. We don't want it to get so bloated that it's hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of files before you even put a screen into it, right? I don't want it. I want to make it kind of lightweight, nimble, easier to understand, and yet pretty darn powerful. And so the way or flexible, I should say, almost kind of limitless, endlessly flexible. So I'm trying to constantly balance those ideas. I think what we're going to end up seeing, whether we like it or not, is I think we're going to end up kind of forced into a little more complexity. All of our expectations change. Our users, our minds as app purchasers, our minds as app developers, the App Store, the whole kind of industry is inching towards more and more complex over time. And that makes sense. I mean, the first iPhone, do you remember the first iPhone app you ever put on your phone?
Um, what was the first thing I did? Because I bought an iPod Touch before I bought an
Okay.
iPhone,
Okay.
and I was frustrated by the fact that the iPod Touch did not have the calendar app on it.
Okay.
You remember that?
I do.
And so I went to great pains to jailbreak an iPod Touch just to get the calendar app.
Good for you. Good for
And
you.
man, that was complex because you had to,
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
like
yeah.
hold one hand up and plug something in and count 9 seconds and unplug it. You remember how the early jailbreak deal
Yeah.
was, and they were like, and if you do this and it blows up, you're screwed.
Yeah, you're gonna go to jail. You're breaking the law.
Exactly. So,
Break your phone. Yeah, my
but
first app.
that was important to me. Yeah.
Yeah, totally. My first app that I ever installed 5 minutes after I got I didn't get the iPod. I started with the phone. Was the Constitution. I got the United States Constitution app,
Huh.
and it was $1, and I bought it, and I'm kind of secretly interested in the Constitution, and it, my kids make fun of me, and everybody thinks I'm a nerd, but I think that's cool. I like to browse these words, and I don't know it as well as I do, but or as well as I should, but it's an important document. I want it on my phone. So I put this Constitution app on my phone, and it was the point I'm trying to demonstrate here. It was very, very simple, very, very simple. It was just a long list. It was, we the people. It was just a. Well, think of the other applications that were in the market then. Pretty simple process, pretty simple software, pretty simple offerings. I mean, that was the essence of what an app was. It was almost like a widget.
Right.
It wasn't really an application, like a software application. It was more like a widget.
Right.
Well, think of today and what we're doing today with these applications and what Apple's doing with these applications and what Google's doing with these applications. It's extraordinary how in 5 years our phones have gone to digital glowing constitutions that made us jump up and down and spend, thousands and thousands of dollars on this stuff, to full-on computers that are doing amazing things, saving people amazing amounts of time, entertaining people for an amazing number of hours. It's amazing. And so the complexity around our whole industry has creeped upwards. That's how we make the stuff, how we create the stuff, how we expect it to work. I mean, you couldn't pay me to download a generic Constitution app today. I would want that thing to be, I want Abe Lincoln reading it to me or something. I mean, the standards are just completely different. And so I'm only saying this because I love complexity. My mind, David's mind, I love that stuff, but it's really hard to help a large audience get going, have some success and volume, help clients, do all the things that our BuzzTouch members do with a really complex thing. So It's always a balance. It's always a balance.
It is because I'm drawn kind of the opposite way. In that whatever it is, it needs to be simple. It needs to be straightforward. It needs to solve a problem.
Right.
It needs to make sense that doing it on my phone is the simplest and easiest way to do it, and it solves a problem for me. That's why I only have like 10 apps on my phone. No games.
Well, yeah, I don't do games.
Angry Birds, but only because the grandkids steal my phone and play it. That's the excuse I use. But a news app, a sports app, a weather app, calculator, some kind of basic things, but it's functions that you want right in the palm of your hand.
Yep, totally right. I'll give you a funny story. You'll get a kick out of this because I believe that there's a direct relation. Cut me off if we're running out of time, but
yeah, we got about.
I believe that there's a direct relationship between kind of our other parts of our lives, how complicated we are, and the way that we tend to write software. Some people are more complicated than others, and some people are more minimalist and more simple than others. And the funniest part of this story is that almost every other aspect of my life, I'm about as minimal as you'll ever meet. I mean, it's amazing. I live out of a backpack almost. I work in a tiny little setting. I My wife and I and our children, our home is very, very simple. I mean, simple stuff. But in computing, you know, my mind goes kind of wild or whatever. But the funny thing is so kids are doing dishes. Kids are growing up. When do you start teaching them how to kind of take care of their own? 6, 7, 8 years old. You're showing them how to do things. And for the life of us, we cannot get our kids to, you know, clear the table, do your dishes, right? And
Right.
so junk everywhere in the kitchen. It happened for months and months and months. And so my wife was the most amazing problem solver. She looks at things in a way that I don't. There's rarely any complexity in the way that she looks at things, but she comes up with a solution and she'll softly whisper it to you and it'll just be right on. And so we're sitting around and kids are, I don't know, 4 and 6 maybe, or 6 and 8, I don't know. And she says, you know, we're not getting very far with this dishes idea. I said, yeah, I see that. And she says, and unfortunately, you know, when we don't get very far with this dishes idea, you know, I'm the one who ends up in the kitchen. You know, you don't do dishes. I'm like, yeah, that's pretty much true. So I'm going to fix it. In fact, I already did. I said, well, how'd you fix it? She says, I just got rid of all the dishes. So sure enough, Lynn went out and got each of us a cup, a plate, a fork, and a knife. And she says, that's what you get. If it's dirty, it's dirty. I don't care. So sure enough, I mean, it was really funny. And she didn't literally throw everything away, but she did organize our minds around this idea that this is your thing. When you're done with it, you know, so our cupboard was empty. There was she had a little hook hanging for the cup and the plate and the fork and the knife. Well, the fork and the knife went in the drawer.
Right.
And Paige and Austin and Lynn and David had our simple little setup. So to this day, almost every single day I'll hear this, or every couple of days or whatever, one of the kids will say, or I'll say it, or Lynn will say it, you know, where's your cup? Or where's your plate? Or where's your fork? As if all families do this, right? As if this is the normal conversation, and we just
the rest
smile
of
at
us
each other.
would go get another one out of the cabinet.
Right, exactly. And so I think when we're talking about software, I thought you'd get a kick out of this story, but when you're talking about software, I tend to overcomplicate things. And sometimes I wish that I had a Lynn to rethink this stuff, and we do now. We've got a bunch of people who support us, and we have a lot of different minds on our leadership team coming from different angles, and we have a lot of different perspectives that we have to balance. And boy, what a blessing to have that. You know, what a blessing to have that. If I was still by myself doing this, I'm pretty convinced that it would be so complicated that nobody would understand. But anyway, that's a whole nother conversation. I think we're about out of time.
Yeah, unfortunately we are. But next time, I'm going to come back to something I mentioned the last time we got together.
Okay.
And you touched on it just a few minutes ago. And that is kind of the life cycle of an app. And the life cycle of a phone. You know, because a phone, upgrade every 20 to 24 months. The app, you shouldn't expect to put an app in the app store and then just leave it.
Yeah, I agree.
What is the life cycle? What should your expectations be when you build an app? So
I agree. And I actually have some creative ways to help aspiring developers kind of manage that. And they're not as extreme as maybe making it self-destruct in 2 years, but along those lines, that's a great conversation. That's a great conversation. Okay. Put that thing on the calendar. Let's have another conversation about it.
All right. Next week, we'll get together and do it again.
Okay, cool.
All right. Thank you, David.
Thank you, Warren. We'll catch you soon.
Okay.